Every day for over 10 years, a man walked 21 miles to work through rain, snow, and silence. He never missed a shift, never showed up late, never asked for help. No one noticed. Until one morning, someone asked him a question that would change everything. Where are you walking from? What followed wasn't just an answer, it was a story that would shake the nation and reveal a quiet kind of strength most people didn't even know existed. Detroit mornings were not kind. They rarely ever were. At 4:30 a.m., the sky was still asleep and the streets wore their silence like a heavy coat. The air had that metallic edge to it, frozen dry, biting at the skin. But through that stillness came the sound of footsteps. Slow, purposeful, familiar. Malik Thompson walked alone like he had for years. No music in his ears, no phone in his hand, just his breath puffing out in small white clouds and the steady crunch of his boots pressing into snow-packed sidewalks. He didn't hurry. He never did. His pace was something between ritual and necessity, like each step mattered, like the walk itself was a part of the job. He lived in a worn-down duplex on the east side, where most of the porches sagged and paint peeled like bark off tired trees. No car in the driveway. There never was. His neighbors had stopped asking a long time ago. Every morning he left while the city was still quiet, before buses began to groan down the streets and corner stores flipped their lights on. The walk to the plastic molding factory was 21 miles away. That's nearly 5 hours on foot. He did it in every kind of weather, under blazing sun, against slanting rain, through black ice and slush. No matter the forecast, Malik walked, and when his shift ended, he walked back. No one at the factory really understood it. At first, his co-workers thought he was just trying to save money. Some joked about it. Malik's training for the Olympics, they'd laugh. But the jokes stopped when they realized he was never late. Not once. Not even when a blizzard shut down half the city. Not even when the buses stopped running. Malik still showed up on time, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused. His supervisor once asked why he didn't move closer or ask for rides. Malik had shrugged almost sheepishly. "I've got a job," he said, "and I've got legs." He didn't talk much beyond that. He was polite, respectful, always the first to lend a hand, but he kept to himself. There was something about the way he moved that made you feel like he was always carrying something you couldn't see. Not a burden exactly, more like a quiet weight. Some people noticed him. The clerk at the gas station who saw him pass every morning with the same nod. The school janitor who shared a corner of the sidewalk with him in winter. They didn't know his name, but they knew the rhythm of his steps, the curve of his shoulders, the way he never broke stride. He became part of the background, a constant, like church bells or traffic lights. There was one winter when the city nearly shut down. Snow came down in thick sheets and the roads turned to glass. Schools closed. Offices told their employees to stay home. But Malik, he showed up like always, boots soaked through lashes, frosted hands, red and raw from the wind. No complaints, no stories. He just clocked in, wiped his feet, and went to work. People stopped questioning it. They started accepting it. The man who walked to work. That was just who he was. Until one morning on the corner of East McNichols and Van Dyke, a college student saw him. The kid was bundled in layers, backpack, slung low earbuds in. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was the look in Malik's eyes, focused, unwavering, like a man chasing something no one else could see. The student pulled out one earbud and asked, "Hey, sir, where are you walking from?" Malik smiled faintly, slowed his steps just long enough to answer, "From home. Gotta make it to work." And just like that, he kept walking into the cold, into the quiet, into the life he had never once asked anyone else to understand. But someone finally did. And from that question, a simple passing moment, everything that followed would unfold like a story waiting to be told. Malik Thompson's neighborhood wasn't the kind of place you'd linger after dark. Most of the houses were half abandoned, and the one he called home had a porch that creaked like it was trying to speak. The windows were patched with cardboard, and the roof bore the silvery scars of duct tape fighting a losing battle against time. Inside, things were neat, painstakingly neat, but old. A tiny sofa with threadbare arms, a flickering lamp that hummed when it was on, and a kitchen with a fridge that rattled louder than it cooled. He lived alone. No wife, no children, no smartphone, no internet. Not even a landline that worked reliably. His world was quiet, analog, invisible. If you weren't looking for Malik, you'd never know he was there. His days revolved around the factory, 8 hours of standing by the same conveyor belt inspecting plastic molds for defects. The pay was modest, barely enough to scrape by, and certainly not enough to afford luxuries like a car or rideshare. The plant was nearly 21 miles away, tucked in an industrial zone far from any reliable bus line. So he walked. Every day, rain or shine, snow or blistering heat. Nearly 34 kilometers total back and forth. It had become a rhythm embedded into his bones. He woke up at 4:00 a.m., packed a peanut butter sandwich into a paper bag, tied his worn work boots tight, and stepped into the street. By the time the sun cracked the skyline, he would already be halfway there. By the time most people hit snooze for the second time, Malik was clocking in. He had never been late, not once. Never called in sick. Never missed a shift. At first, the younger guys on the floor snickered, called him boots behind his back, joked about his Flintstone commute. But over time, those laughs softened into nods, then into quiet respect. One of them, a stocky kid named Daryl, once tried to give him a ride. "You walk all the way from Linwood," Daryl had asked, disbelief etched across his face. Malik had just smiled. "I get there, don't I?" He never asked for favors. Never lingered in break rooms or joined the lunchtime gossip. When someone asked why he didn't move closer, he said, "I got what I need." When a manager offered him fewer shifts so he could rest, he politely declined. "I'm all right," he'd said. "Just glad to work." To some it felt like stubborn pride. To others, something more cryptic. But Malik had his reasons tucked deep where words couldn't quite reach. And even as years passed and new hires came and went, Malik stayed. Steady as sunrise. Neighbors barely noticed anymore. His figure bobbing along the sidewalk before dawn had become part of the landscape. Like streetlights, like the stop sign at the corner. No one asked questions. They just moved around him as if he were invisible. But Malik noticed everything. The changing cracks in the pavement, which porch lights stayed on through the night, the stray cat that lingered by the bakery on 7th. He saw the city as it stirred awake, as it stretched and groaned through seasons. And still every day he walked, not out of habit, not even out of necessity, but because in his own quiet way, Malik believed in showing up, in keeping promises, in being someone others could count on even if they never noticed. So he kept walking, until one day someone did notice, and everything began to change. That morning, like so many others, Malik stood quietly beneath the faded bus shelter near Gratiot Avenue. The plexiglass panels were scratched and fogged from years of neglect, and the cold January air bit through his coat as he waited for the transfer bus that would take him halfway to his job. The rest of the way, over 10 miles, he would walk. As always, he was sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos with a chipped lid when a young voice interrupted his quiet. "Excuse me, sir," came the tentative tone of a college student, backpack slung lazily over one shoulder, eyes curious but kind. Do you walk here every day?" Malik looked over, caught off guard by the question. Most people passed him like he was invisible, just another weary soul trying to survive Detroit's brutal winter mornings. But this young man didn't seem to want anything. Just an answer. "I do," Malik replied after a moment, nodding slowly. "Been doing it a long time." The young man introduced himself as Evan. He was heading to Wayne State, and the two exchanged small talk while waiting. But when Malik mentioned that his job was in Rochester Hills, nearly 21 miles away, Evan's face shifted in disbelief. "You walk that far?" Malik gave a slight smile. "Not all the way. 2 buses take me about halfway. The rest I do on foot. There ain't a route that goes all the way. Been like that for years." Evan stared at him stunned. "Why don't you why not move closer or change jobs?" Malik didn't flinch. "Can't afford to move. Job's got benefits. It's a good place. I'm lucky to have it." There was no self-pity in his tone, no grand speech, just truth plain, steady, unwavering. As the bus arrived, Evan hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "Would it be okay if I shared your story I think people should know." Malik shrugged, slightly amused. "If it helps somebody, go ahead." That same morning, Evan posted a photo of Malik standing by the shelter coat, zipped to the neck, steam rising from his coffee. The caption read, Met a man this morning who walks 21 miles every day just to keep his job. No complaints, no excuses, just quiet strength. The internet didn't just scroll past, it ignited. By lunchtime, the post had over 10,000 shares. By dinner, it had hit 50,000. People were tagging news stations, writing long comments, sending virtual prayers. Some were shocked. Others felt ashamed of the excuses they made. More than a few cried. Within 48 hours, the Detroit Free Press ran a story. CNN picked it up next, then ABC. Even BBC World tweeted about the man who walks Detroit. Reporters called the factory. Neighbors peeked out their doors. Co-workers who had teased Malik suddenly looked at him differently. Evan, overwhelmed by the response, decided to do more. He launched a GoFundMe with the modest goal of raising $5,000 to help Malik buy a reliable used car. But by the end of the third day, the donations hit $75,000. On the fifth, they passed $350,000 and kept going. From every corner of the country, people gave what they could. Retired veterans, single moms, working-class folks who'd known struggle. Some gave $5, others gave $500. The messages were just as moving as the money for your courage. Because my dad worked like you. You remind us all what perseverance looks like. Then a local dealership reached out. Without hesitation, they gifted Malik a brand new Ford Taurus. It was blue-polished, gleaming in the winter sun, the kind of car Malik had never even dreamed of sitting in, let alone owning. When they handed him the keys, surrounded by cameras and reporters, Malik stood frozen for a second. Then he said almost inaudibly, "I don't deserve all this, but thank you, truly." In that moment, the man who had once walked alone through blizzards and darkness now stood in the warm light of gratitude, a symbol of something bigger than himself. He hadn't asked for fame. He hadn't asked for help. All he'd done was walk, and by walking, he'd led an entire nation towards something we'd almost forgotten: simple human decency. The spotlight had found him, but Malik Thompson had never gone looking for it. When he appeared on television for the first time, sitting awkwardly in a borrowed suit under bright studio lights, he looked every bit like a man out of place. His hands were clasped tightly, his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to shrink away from the attention. The host leaned in with a smile and asked, "How does it feel to be America's working-class hero?" Malik gave a modest chuckle and said, "I don't think I did anything special. I just didn't want to be late to work." It wasn't the soundbite they were hoping for, but it was the most honest thing anyone had said on television in a long time. And just like that, the interviews faded, the headlines moved on, and the world returned to its regular programming. But Malik remained the same. Every morning he woke up at 4:30, put on the same heavy coat, packed the same thermos of coffee, and made his way to the same job at the same plant. The only difference now was that instead of walking, he drove a quiet silver Ford Taurus, which he parked far from the factory entrance like always, as if he didn't want to make a scene. His coworkers noticed, of course. Some teased him good-naturedly now about becoming famous. A few asked what he planned to do with the hundreds of thousands of dollars raised for him. Malik would only shrug and say, "I haven't thought about it much, but maybe I know what I'll do." He didn't elaborate, and soon people stopped asking. The attention he once received began to fade just the way he preferred it. He declined invitations to awards dinners, turned down offers for book deals, and even moved out of his old apartment without telling anyone where he was going. Word around the factory was that he'd bought a modest home on the outskirts of town, somewhere quieter away from the cameras and questions. It was typical Malik: quiet exits, quiet returns. But then one morning something happened that broke his 10-year routine. He left his shift 2 hours early. That might not sound remarkable for most people, but for Malik Thompson it was unheard of. He had never left early, never called in sick, never arrived late, not even during the blizzard of 2014 that had shut down half the city. "Is everything okay?" a younger colleague named Ramon had asked as Malik removed his gloves and punched out at the time clock. Malik paused, met Ramon's eyes, and replied gently, "I just need to help a friend." Ramon didn't ask for more. No one did. To them, Malik had already earned the right to disappear whenever he wanted. Maybe he was going to buy himself something nice. Maybe he had a family member in trouble. Or maybe some quietly hoped he was finally taking a well-deserved break. But what no one knew, not the manager, not the coworkers, not even Evan, the college student who had unknowingly changed Malik's life, was that behind the stoic, humble exterior of this man was a promise. A promise made long before the donations poured in, before the car was gifted, before the viral fame, and long before Malik Thompson had become a symbol of working-class dignity. And this promise, unlike the job, the schedule, or the headlines, was deeply personal. Because while everyone else had seen a man walking to work for the sake of a paycheck, what they hadn't seen was the reason he kept going. In the weeks that followed his early departure, Malik spoke even less than usual. But there was a quiet shift in him, more thoughtful pauses, more lingering stares out the break room window. His co-workers thought he was finally letting success settle into his bones. But they were wrong. He hadn't changed. He was preparing. And while the world had already written the ending to his story, Malik knew better. His story wasn't finished. In fact, the most important chapter had just begun. 2 months had passed since Malik Thompson's name had graced the national headlines, since the Ford dealership handed him the keys to a brand new car, and since donations from strangers had surged past $350,000. People expected change, radical, obvious change. Maybe a new house in the suburbs, or at the very least a vacation to someplace warm. But for those who still saw Malik, there was only stillness. No designer clothes, no fine dinners, no sign that he'd even touched the money at all. At the factory, he kept eating the same ham and cheese sandwich he packed every morning. He showed up at the same time, parked in the same faraway spot, nodded the same quiet greetings to the security guard. If anyone noticed anything different, it wasn't in how Malik lived. It was in how little they understood him. Some of his co-workers whispered that he was waiting for the right investment, waiting to retire in peace. But Malik wasn't retiring. He had even moved, yes, but not into something grand. He relocated to a smaller, older apartment at the edge of the city, far from the buzz, far from the curious eyes. No one knew exactly where, not even Ramon, who worked beside him every day. But someone did notice one peculiar thing. An old neighbor from his previous building, Miss Claudia, said she often saw Malik driving off at night. Not late, not suspicious, she recalled. Just quiet, like he had somewhere to be. Then next morning he'd be right back in uniform like clockwork. A few folks tried to ask him outright, "Malik, what are you going to do with all that money?" when asked during a break. Malik looked up, blinked slowly, and smiled that same serene smile that seemed to disarm every question. "Haven't figured it out yet," he said, and then, as always, changed the subject. But clues began to surface in the most unexpected places. One afternoon, Malik walked into the HR office, not for a complaint, not for a raise, but to update his tax and financial information. Simple paperwork. But as he waited for the administrator, he sat quietly in the lobby and began organizing a thick folder of documents. A junior employee happened to glance over and noticed a few hospital logos printed at the top of some pages. Prescription forms, insurance waivers, admission letters. Not in Malik's name. The buzz returned. People speculated. Is he sick? Is someone in his family? But no one could name a relative. No one had even met someone who had been to Malik's apartment, old or new. Then, like a trail of breadcrumbs, scattered by accident, a few threads began to connect. A local pastor in East Detroit mentioned in a community newsletter that an anonymous donor had paid for a church member's urgent medical care. A miracle, the pastor called it. The man's name was Raymond Carter. That name wouldn't have meant anything to most, but it meant something to Malik. Raymond was once his closest friend. They grew up 2 blocks apart, shared the same after-school jobs, and once even talked about starting a handyman business together before life separated them. Malik got a stable job at the factory. Raymond drifted, bounced between jobs, struggled to keep a roof over his head, and now Raymond was dying. Cancer. Stage 2, doctors said not yet terminal, but aggressive enough that every week counted. He'd gone in for a checkup complaining of back pain and was told he needed treatment right away. But Raymond had no insurance, no savings. The first hospital gave him painkillers and sent him home. He went home to a rented room with peeling wallpaper and a broken space heater. And he waited to die, until without explanation a car pulled up outside one evening. Malik stepped out with a paper bag of groceries and a quiet nod. Raymond, thin and exhausted, stared from the doorway. "Malik," he said, barely above a whisper. "I heard you needed help," Malik replied, stepping inside without asking permission. The next day, Raymond was admitted to a different hospital, one that didn't ask questions, because someone had already signed the forms, already paid the deposit. And so while the rest of the city was still wondering whether Malik was saving his fortune or wasting it, he was already spending it in silence and shadows without announcement or fanfare. Because some people don't see money as a reward. Some see it as a responsibility. Long before the world knew his name, before there were headlines or hashtags, Malik Thompson was just another factory worker sharing a half-soggy sandwich with a man named Raymond Carter. That factory had no break room, only a rusted bench under a flickering exit sign. They'd sit there splitting whatever food they'd brought from home, sometimes crackers, sometimes peanut butter and bread, often just silence. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. Raymond had a laugh that could fill a room and dreams bigger than his bank account. He talked about owning a food truck someday, one that played jazz and served barbecue sliders. Malik, ever the quiet one, listened more than he spoke. But he admired Raymond's fire. Even when the company started downsizing, even when rumors of closure circled like vultures, Raymond still cracked jokes at lunch, still believed in what comes next. Then came the layoffs. The plant shut down with barely 2 weeks' notice. Malik found another job at the plastics factory where he still worked, but Raymond wasn't so lucky. He bounced between part-time gigs, lost his insurance, and eventually, bit by bit, slid into poverty's silent undertow. Malik tried to stay in touch, but it got harder. Phone numbers changed. Letters came back unopened. Then one cold morning, not long after his viral fame, Malik heard the news. Raymond had cancer. Stage 2. Treatable. But only if someone acted quickly. When Malik walked into that dim apartment on the east side of Detroit, the smell of mildew hit him first. Raymond was thinner than he remembered, sitting in a worn recliner with a blanket around his shoulders and an ashtray full of cough drops on the side table. He smiled when he saw Malik, though it looked like it hurt. "Didn't think you'd find me," he croaked. "I never stopped looking," Malik said. They didn't talk much that night. Malik brought food, filled the fridge, and made calls. The next morning, Raymond had a hospital appointment, private care, no questions asked. Within a week, he was transferred to the best oncology center in Michigan, where specialists evaluated his case and agreed the prognosis wasn't hopeless. But time was precious. What no one outside that hospital room knew was that Malik covered every single expense. Not just the treatments, the PET scans, the biopsies, the cocktail of aggressive medications, but also the hotel stays for Raymond's family, the home nurse hired for aftercare, and even a small fund to cover the man's unpaid utility bills. When the hospital's finance department called to confirm the donor's identity, Malik asked them not to mention his name. "Just say it's from a friend," he told them. It wasn't the first time Malik had watched someone he loved waste away from cancer. Years ago, he stood helpless at his mother's bedside as she slipped away, not because her illness was untreatable, but because the family couldn't afford the treatments. He remembered the sting of that moment with painful clarity, the sterile smell of the room, the flickering IV light, the way her hands turned cold before her voice faded. That grief never quite left him. It settled into the corners of his life, shaping him in ways no one else could see. He'd never said it aloud, but perhaps that was why he kept working so hard, never missed a shift, never allowed himself the luxury of ease. Maybe he was preparing for the day someone else might need him. When Raymond's sister asked Malik through tears why he was doing all this, why he would spend so much, give so much for someone the world had forgotten, Malik looked down for a long moment before replying. "Because I know what it's like," he said softly, "to love someone and not be able to save them. I couldn't save my mom, but maybe this time I can do something different." There was no triumph in his voice, no pride, just resolve, a quiet, almost sacred sense of duty, the kind that doesn't need attention or applause or anyone to understand. Because for Malik, the greatest act of redemption wasn't in changing his own life. It was in making sure someone else didn't lose theirs. Raymond's recovery wasn't miraculous. It was medical, slow, and painful. But it was real. After 3 months of grueling treatment, his doctors announced the tumor had shrunk substantially. If you'd come in even 2 or 3 weeks later, one of them said we'd be having a very different conversation. There was no guarantee of total remission, but there was now a fighting chance, a path forward. And that path had been paved by one man's quiet decision to care. When a nurse asked Raymond if he wanted to nominate his donor for a public recognition program, he simply shook his head. He wouldn't want that, he said. Then after a pause, he added, "He once told me his mom died of cancer because they couldn't afford the treatment, I think he couldn't save her, so now he saved me instead. That sentence, barely whispered in a sterile hospital room, would slowly ripple outward, not through press releases or viral posts, but through the quiet mouths of those who had crossed paths with Malik. A gas station clerk recalled how Malik once paid for a stranger's gas without saying a word. A nurse aide said he dropped off warm meals at the clinic once a week under a different name. A local mechanic mentioned how Malik insisted on covering a neighbor's car repairs in cash, no receipt. The man never asked for credit, he just kept giving. At the factory, when the management planned an employee appreciation ceremony, Malik was on the list of honorees. When his name was called and applause broke out, he stood near the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, then quietly stepped back. A supervisor walked over to coax him toward the stage, but Malik shook his head. "I didn't do those things for claps," he said, his voice low. "I did them so I wouldn't have regrets." Wordlessly, he returned to his workstation. It was that kind of silence, purposeful, not shy, that people began to notice more. Not the absence of words, but the presence of something deeper. And in that silence, others started listening differently. One morning, tucked into his mailbox was a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note, likely from a child, scrawled in blue ink. "Dear Mr. Malik, I read about you every morning before school. You make me think I can be someone too. I didn't drop out because of you. Thank you. Jalen, age 15. Malik read it twice, then tucked it into a small cigar box where he kept a few old photos and a letter from his mother. He never responded, never looked for the boy, but he carried the weight of that note like it was gold. The media calls had long since faded. Book agents gave up. Talk shows moved on to flashier stories. Malik never wrote a memoir. He never accepted speaking gigs. When a popular network offered to do a "Where Are They Now" segment, he declined with a short email. "I'm still here, just doing what I've always done." Only now he wasn't walking to work. He drove an old Ford, nothing fancy but reliable. Sometimes he'd pull over to help someone with a flat tire. Other times he'd drive a neighbor to their clinic appointment. Still the same city, still the same man, just a slightly different route. One late autumn afternoon, he passed a schoolyard where children were racing each other down cracked sidewalks, their laughter bouncing through the crisp air. He slowed the car and watched for a moment. The wind rattled leaves across the windshield. For the first time in a long time, his shoulders relaxed. He wasn't carrying guilt anymore. He had given something back to the world, something no spotlight could measure. Malik Thompson became the kind of man people spoke about in whispers in homes and break rooms, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he reminded everyone what it meant to choose kindness when no one was watching. He proved that real legacy doesn't come from applause, it comes from action. And in that simple truth, his story lived on. Quietly, firmly, like footsteps on a frozen pavement, heard only by those who pause long enough to listen. Thank you for staying with us until the end of Malik Thompson's journey. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Just one sentence can help spread his quiet kindness even further. And don't forget to subscribe for more Black stories and powerful life lessons that deserve to be heard.